All right. Uh, Today I'd like to talk about metaphors of politics. I was thinking about this yesterday. I listened to a podcast called The Remnant with Jonah Goldberg, and he was talking about where the metaphor of left and right came from. And I'd heard this before. I think George Lakoff and Mark Johnson also mentioned this. And man, I haven't researched it thoroughly, but the story is basically that there's a system of government that had, a building in which you sat on the left or you sat on the right, and that's where this left wing and right wing idea came from. And often the argument goes that, well, this is a very silly conception because that was a particular government in a particular time, and that we've kind of continued to use this in a way that's just overly simplistic. It's kind of a detriment to political analysis, and there's a lot in that I agree with. But what I don't agree with is that when people use these terms, that's what it's actually pointing back to, or that's what's conceptually active when people are speaking. I think more so is that we map spatial relationships onto abstractions. So for instance, time. Like, we think of time as if it's, or we talk about time as if it's spatial. The future is ahead of us. When we move forward, we move into the future. The past is behind us. That's a spatial abstraction that we use to conceive of time. We think of affection and intimacy spatially. So when we move closer to someone, we become more intimate with them. When we move further away, we become less intimate. Again, it's a way to conceive of these kind of complex, abstract relationships that we have in an easy way to talk about, because we are these bodies moving through space. We walk around, we can move closer and further away from things. Things can be to the left of us, to the right of us, behind us, in front of us. All of those, they're much simpler to understand than the actual complex realities of things like intimacy and people's political beliefs. So that's, the story of kind of the genealogy of where things originate is interesting. But I don't think it's what's active, or is essentially the profound concept that we need to grapple with. It's this spatial object conceptual relationship that I just described. So that's one point. I think that when people speak about left and right in the center, it's often egocentric. And I don't mean that in a negative way. I just mean egocentric in the sense that you are centering your particular place in this abstract space. And you were looking to the left and you were looking to the right, and you were seeing what is to the left of me, what is to the right of me. And where is the center? And it's especially interesting to me of where people think the center is, because their spatial relationship on that political spectrum really says a lot about where they place the center. I've often seen kind of arguments between people that are more extremely left or more extremely right. They are, of course, putting the center closer to them, and they're kind of disdainfully or mocking this idea that the center is actually closer to the other side. So that's one way to to conceive of this politics, and it's an important one. It's simplistic, but all metaphors are simplistic, and all metaphors leave out particular information. They essentially flatten the complexities of reality in order to talk about it more simply, which can be very effective. I mean, obviously, since everyone uses it. Now some people want to, you see online, some people will make more complex graphs, so they'll basically add a Y dimension. So instead of not just left and right political, there's an up and down now, right? And so, again, you're adding a layer of complexity, and that might get you to flesh out, another dimension of this political space. This isn't so different from the metaphor we use to talk about interpersonal relationships, right? Where we are like, let's say you're in a relationship and you're having a fight with your partner, right? And in that argument, you're just like, why can't you see my side? Right? And so this kind of compounded, complex metaphor that we argue with is essentially like, I am sitting in a particular perspective or a spatial relationship that gives me a perspective which is different than yours. And what I want you to do is walk over to my point in space and look at this thing that has just happened from my point of view. And then once you see it from my perspective, you will understand it. So again, another spatial relationship in which we are kind of navigating these complex problems. Another interesting political metaphor is movements. I touched on this briefly when I talked about the Me Too movement, but there's political movements too. The Tea Party is a movement. There's the women's movement. There's there's revolutionary movements, right? So a movement, right? A movement is moving from point A in space to point B in space. And when movements occur, everyone is generally just very excited that movement is happening. Like, the one thing they agree on is, I don't like this particular point in space in which we are. And there's this general excitement that things are shifting, right? Hey, we're moving somewhere. Great. We're going on a little trip. But generally what happens in these movements is that once you start moving, it becomes more apparent that not a lot of people really agree on where we should be going. Where is the point B in space, essentially? And what is that definitively? So again, I think, Me Too is relevant. And it's interesting because in these kind of movements, it doesn't apply to this. It applies to every type of movement you can think of. Not many people agree on what point B is. And then the argument becomes, we haven't moved far enough, or we've gone too far. We've overshot point B, or no, we're not even there yet. Right? And all of this kind of happens in this ambiguous, vague, abstract language that really makes it hard to talk about, because unless you have a really concrete conception of where you're going, talking about going too far and not going far enough is almost impossible to figure out. And a lot of these things exist in this ambiguous space where as you're moving, you're also maybe shifting and changing your mind about where you're going, right? And in the initial excitement of moving falls away, and it kind of turns into this more bitter debate about where we're going. When the Republican Party took power, Donald Trump was elected. They had both houses of Congress, and I think a similar thing happened when Obama was elected. The Democrats controlled both houses of Congress. There is this idea that, well, now is the time that we're going to really enact the political change so we can get to where we're going. And what both of those parties discovered was that they actually didn't agree about very much, besides the fact that they didn't like the particular point in space in which they were at. So anyway, that's one way to look at this and analyze it. I think it's one of the powerful features of conceptual metaphor theory, which is a small field in cognitive linguistics, that it gives you the ability to break down these large abstractions that we kind of unconsciously are in and look at the parts. It's like, what is this conceptual system that I'm participating in? How does it work? It's like opening up a car, look at the engine. Like, how does this thing work? Again, all of that I've talked about is wrapped up or compounded into this journey metaphor. Like, journey metaphors are everywhere. Because we view the future ahead of us, the past is behind us. We're walking on this path. We're headed into the future. Things are changing. We're going on this journey. So that's basically, and so when political parties lose, often people say something like, well, they're lost in the wilderness, right? The Republican Party was lost in the wilderness when they lost both houses, or they lost the Congress and the presidency, and vice versa. And that idea is that, you were on this path, and all of a sudden, you've lost the path. And now you're in the brush, you're moving around, it's not apparent how to get back on track. And that this is supposed to be some kind of time for deep reflection. And the proper use of being lost in the wilderness is to get your bearings, right? It is to suddenly become more aware of your surroundings in a way that you weren't before. You were just walking down the path. Maybe you were looking at the flowers. You weren't really interested in a lot of things that weren't apparent in your consciousness, because that's what we do when we're on a path. We just start to notice all this other stuff. We forget when you're enjoying yourself that you're on a journey, right? When you get lost, all of a sudden, all of that narrows down to this very specific attentional point of, I have to figure out where I am. Do political parties really do that? I don't think so. I think to some extent maybe, but I think this is one of those metaphors that actually is fairly not descriptive of what's actually happening. The American people seem to swing back and forth between giving one party power and then the other party power. And doesn't seem to me at least so much that they view that one party has done the work and really got its bearings and understands something essential about this journey that we're on. It's essentially that they've gotten sick of one of the parties, now they're going to give the other one the chance, and it's almost regardless of how much of that work they've actually done. So we got movements, we have being lost in the wilderness, we have this left, right, center dynamic. Now the center is interesting to me because I really, it's a place that I really have been interested in this kind of linguistic way, conceptual linguistic way that I've been talking about all of these ideas. Because one way to conceive of the center is that it's just the middle ground between the two extremes, right? And people kind of use this derisively. I don't know how to say that word. I don't know if that's right, but they use it as like antagonistically. People that claim they're centrist, it's basically like, well, you're just not taking a position on something, right? You're just looking at one extreme and the other extreme, and you're saying, well, maybe somewhere in the middle between them. And they view this as kind of an illegitimate move. For instance, there are certain issues like abortion, where it's like, well, how can you be a centrist on something like that? How can you look at both extremes and come to some kind of middle view, or whether we go to war or not go to war with a particular country? How could you be a centrist on that? Like, it doesn't make sense to just always take a middle path between extremes. And I agree with that, and to some extent. And I don't actually think that that's what, at least I mean by the center, or just thinking about what the center means. To me, the center is being, again, this is a spatial object relationship, spatial abstract space. And you sit in that and you look to the left and you look to the right. And do you find anything of value on either side? I think centrism, to me, is saying yes to that, is saying that there are these, on either extreme, you see value in what the overarching political philosophy is. So on the extreme left, you see that there is this real dissatisfaction with where we are, right? And there is a future vision of where we can go that is so much better than where we currently are. And that we need to do everything we can to get to that point, right? That seems undoubtedly true to me. And then you look to the extreme right and you see, or just look to the right. It doesn't have to be extremes, but you look to the right and you see a skepticism about our ability to navigate the space, right? Our skepticism about that we really know what we're doing, and that the things that we're going to enact to try to get to the place that we want to go is probably going to have a lot of unintended consequences and might make us worse off, right? It is essentially a check on this progressive future. So just think about this just personally, right? Because I feel like we're bad thinking in large scale abstractions about these kind of things, but we're a little bit better about thinking about our own personal experience. And psychologically, these are two modes that should be working very well with each other. Like, let's say you're living in a city, you're in a relationship, you get offered a job in another city, right? Or you meet someone and you really hit it off with that person and you start wondering, maybe I shouldn't be in my current relationship. Maybe things could be better with this other person, right? In both of those situations, you're imagining a future for yourself, which could be better. But then you're also hopefully you're tempering that with kind of a skepticism of trying to figure out, well, yeah, but I could make my situation a whole lot worse, because it's pretty easy, if you're a human being, to look at your past track record and your past decision making and saying, wow, I have messed up a lot of decisions and I have made things worse for myself any number of times. So I know that's possible. And so maybe I've learned something from this track record that I have, and I can better navigate these types of situations, right? And so just because maybe you have sexual attraction or a brief emotional attraction to another human being doesn't mean that that's a good move, and that you kind of skeptically watch things play out. And don't just move in the direction that you feel pulled towards. Right. I think that's all very easily understood, and it's hard to disagree with any of that, right? Well, that to me is what I think is a good description of what it means to be a centrist, which is that you are valuing the tools that both of those perspectives give you, and you try to apply them to our social, political reality. So I think this is important. This whole thing of understanding metaphorical concepts, that they come from the body and us moving around in space, and that when we speak abstractly, this is what we're talking about. I think it's important because it should give us a little more humility about speaking this way. Because obviously, this is an incredibly simplistic way to think. We are taking our human experience, and we are this human bodily experience, and we are trying to understand the interrelations of the billions and billions of people on this planet, and the social and political realities of all of that through this, through walking around, being on a path, getting off the path, getting lost, finding your way again. So I think that's just important. For me, that's been helpful. I think it would be helpful to a lot of these political conversations. I think people are already starting to do that, and that I see lots of articles, or I don't know if lots is the right word, but I've seen a number of articles kind of make somewhat similar points about seeing the limitations of thinking left and right. But I hope what this is seen is that, it goes beyond that. It goes beyond just the left and right. It goes through this whole journey metaphor, through movement metaphors, through left, right, and center. So now I gotta go back to work because I'm on my lunch break. But that's it.